I'm actually extremely excited to be here. Andy, to be sharing the stage with you is actually something quite amazing. I don't know if people know exactly your background, but so Andy but he was a board member of the Continuous Delivery Foundation. He was director of product engineering at Netflix. And actually, interesting story here about this one is that Andy and I actually met in 2018 when we got invited to Spinnaker conference in Seattle. Unbeknownst to them, we didn't actually use Spinnaker at the time. Of course, since then we've acquired Armory. But it was quite an interesting conversation because they really quickly found out that we weren't on the technology. But that's when we met, and then now you've moved from there and actually doing the same and similar things at OpenAI. So genuinely, thank you here. I'm honored to be on the stage with you.
Thank you very much. I wish my parents were here or something. It's like
I'll send them a note, I promise.
Or maybe my wife. Could you do that as well?
Absolutely. Andy, I think you've worked at some amazing companies, and I think one of the things that'd be interesting for the crowd here is, what are those differences between, say, Netflix and OpenAI? Two very different missions, two very different goals. I'm assuming two very different teams, but kind of give us the lay of the land if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I joined Netflix in 2013, and that was during Netflix's scale up. And it was fast moving and a lot of agency given to leaders and teams to essentially innovate and solve kind of like a scale problem. And if you think about 2013, a lot of the things we take for granted today, we hadn't really figured out yet. We, as in the industry, like continuous delivery was a phrase, but no one had actually built a platform for it. And so in many ways, OpenAI is very similar. It's a scale up. But to put it in perspective, it took Netflix about 10 years to get to 100 million daily active users, and OpenAI got there in 1 year. And so, yeah, it's pretty amazing. And so OpenAI is a massive scale up with all of the same challenges of every scale up, whether it's been like Facebook, Google. There's a number of companies here that are scale ups. And the biggest difference between, let's say, OpenAI and Netflix from a technology standpoint is Netflix had time to kind of figure all this out. OpenAI doesn't really have that time or that luxury because it went from 0 to 100 million essentially overnight. And so it's very much like we've always said, changing the engine on the plane as it's flying, and I've been saying that for years. I'm now actually doing it. Like every time before that, we had the luxury of actually landing and figuring it out. This time, it's like we don't have the luxury. So, very different from that respect.
That's awesome. I think one of the things that started the industry was move fast and break things. I don't know who's cool with breaking things. Everybody good with that still? No, I think we've had to kind of move that to move fast and don't break things. In fact, that was our original tagline way back in the day. But kind of what's your feeling on how the industry's changed in that sense? Yeah,
so it's funny because we always say, and I think the media loves to say, move fast and break things. And I'm sure there's some Meta, Facebook folks here, and it's famously attributed to Zuck. But even the Meta folks will say it was like move fast with stable infrastructure, right? It's so no one wants anything to break. And I think that was the biggest maybe realization at Netflix was when things broke, people couldn't stream, and thankfully no one would die. Although we did have people threaten to kill themselves online if they couldn't stream. I mean that's pretty. It's horrible, right? Anyway, so we were very, very much focused on making sure that we could move very, very fast. We also had the luxury that we had no competition without breaking. So fast forward to today, the AI space is highly competitive. And if you think about the players in the space, obviously they're very large behemoths with huge pockets full of money. That being Google and Meta. And then obviously the up-and-comers like Anthropic and others. And so once again, it's very true. We want to move fast, but we don't want to break anything because, again, everyone has choices, right? If you go to ChatGPT or something else, or even Amazon and it breaks, you can just go to the next guy. You can go to Walmart. There was a Walmart person here, right? And so, yeah, move fast and break things has never really been true. And if anything, it's all the more important that you move fast with a high degree of confidence and not break anything.
I love that. One of the things we've talked about a lot today was guardrails. And I think guardrails and gates are two different things that people put in place in the software delivery lifecycle or software development lifecycle. What's your take on guardrails over gates, and where do you see them fitting across the board?
Yeah, so it's interesting because the previous session with Expedia, I have some opinions. So at a high level, I think in order to move fast and not break things, you want to give teams agency. So you want to let them move as fast as possible with like guardrails. Is as soon as you put gates in front of dev teams, and I think someone else mentioned this, they just go around it, right? Everyone's been at that company where it's like, we're not going to shadow IT. I actually did that at a previous life. And so then you have to balance the business needs. So at Netflix, the company takes your credit card, so there's PII and other, just financial controls. OpenAI, similarly, we take your credit card, but we also have a lot of data that is really important. And so the idea of balancing move fast, again, and not break things with guardrails over gates, and to the extent that you can provide guardrails so that people can do the right thing without causing unnecessary delay is really that tension. And sometimes you do need gates. I get it at large companies, especially when you get into policies. This is something you and I have talked a lot about, and especially in the AI space. I think everyone is concerned with data and how it's being used, and so there'll be a lot of, I think, very interesting discussions on how we balance guardrails over gates, and probably more gates, where it's necessary.
I think we see this in a lot of our highly regulated industries where we need to make it easy to do the right things, we need those guardrails. But there are some things we need to put boundaries on because there are just limitations that are, regulatorily bound or security bound that we just can't break, or the costs might even be extreme. And so I think there is a fine balance, but I think to your point, making that part easy to do the right thing is the easiest way to get the most gain, right? Because now we're going to actually empower people to go and give them those easy paths to production, almost those golden paths. So I think, to your point, love the idea of guardrails, and only gates when necessary, I think is...
Yeah, and thinking through that last demo and then what we're, experiencing at OpenAI and then, previous lives, this tension between guardrails and gates has a tangential effect of, I'll say, tiering, and you and I were talking about this. Many companies on their journey to, let's say, just continuous delivery, view it as, it's a nice to have. Like, let's just get this stuff out into production. There's a team that can do that. And we view it as almost like tier 2. Like if Harness or Spinnaker or whatever it is, your tool of choice, Jenkins, goes down, not a big deal because like some dev can just cube cuddle or whatever it is, do something in production. And that works when you're a small startup. I guess it can also work if you're an enterprise. But as soon as you start getting into these regulatory, environments, that flips. That whole notion is null, right? And it kind of makes teams recognize that, oh wow, like all this delivery, platform software that we're writing is now tier 1, because if that goes down, we can't fix production. And that goes back to these guardrails over gates. If you do it right, then you do make it very easy to get things into production, but then you don't maybe recognize that like now it's no longer easy to do it from, Jill's dev box.
It's interesting, this idea of tier 2 versus tier 1, and I think the industry, 7 years ago, to your point, it was okay that your Jenkins servers were down for a week. I mean, I literally had those instances, and I see a few nodding heads, so I wasn't alone. That's great. But now, imagine that I couldn't deploy, even for hours. That would be a huge red flag. And I think one of the things you even said earlier when we were talking was it almost became N-1. So if those systems that are deploying, are that relevant and that important, they have to actually have almost, better uptime than even the applications that are serving themselves.
That's right. So we had this whole argument, this was years ago, there's tier 1, there's tier 2, there's tier 3, and then we dreamed up, there's tier 0. Because those things, the tier 0s, are required for the tier 1s, and it was like this argument, well, is like, for example, our Netflix's delivery platform, is it tier 0? And I think the other thing that's fascinating about that whole discussion is, again, through the evolution of just continuous delivery over the last decade, I think it's always been viewed as like a nice to have. And then eventually, once you get it, you realize I can't live without it. And then there's the scary aspect of, well, now all of a sudden it's tier one. But I think another way of looking at it is that that's an indication of how successful and how important it is to the business to move fast. To your point about, a couple, let's say, hourly deployments. Back in the day. In fact, it was the previous one that he was saying, it was Rick, right? Or Rick Hicks. Sorry if I got his name wrong. Was saying, he remembers the days when it was like, waterfall, and like, there was this fascinating discussion. I was talking with my team about like, various delivery systems we've had in our careers. And I started my career at IBM, and I don't even remember how we got that stuff into production. Because it was like we did it once, like once a year. But anyways, this whole idea of like, once you start moving fast and doing, multiple deployments a day, an hour, you have to recognize that the business becomes hooked on it. It's heroin, right? We can move fast finally. In fact, funny story, regarding that. So we were talking about metrics earlier, Dora versus space, and I don't like Dora, for the record. And one of Dora's metrics is like deployment frequency or something. At Netflix's journey, that was one of our metrics early in the day, so to speak. So like, let's say 9 years ago, how many deployments are we deploying a day? And we gave up counting after 4,000 times a day. It was like, what's the point of this number? It keeps going up and to the right. And so we looked for other metrics. At OpenAI, we're not doing that many. So once again, that number is important. Like, how many deployments are we doing a day? And it's fun just to be like, well, in due time, that metric will become meaningless, and we'll look for something more important that the business really cares about.
I think what we're seeing, though, is the industry's changed. It's really gone and it's matured. And you see this also in the maintenance aspect of this. One of the things that I always look at, applications, I kind of compare them to airplanes. And the reality is you would not have 5,000 runways for 5,000 planes at the San Jose airport. That would be insane. The maintenance headache would be astronomical. What you do is you got one that can land the A380. The rest of them can land all the other planes. You got some in different directions in case the winds are weird. And what we're trying to do now and today is the same concept. If we want to be those tier one services, if we want to be able to maintain and keep that up and running, you can't have this sprawl. It's impossible. You have to templatize things. We have to run in a don't repeat yourself type of model. It has to become dry. What have you seen kind of in the industry as well in that space? So lesson learned from Netflix is we built this system, and it was super powerful, and people deployed, all the time. But what happened is we had the 5,000 runways. So the company had, too many pipelines to count, and they were all unique. Or I should say, they were all copies of someone else's, and then they forked. And that became a maintenance challenge. I'm happy to say that the team today is doing something different and solving it, so, go Netflix. But that was a lesson learned of like, wow, all these different ways of doing, basically getting something into production with a great signal. It turns out you don't need to do it 5,000 different ways. There's probably a handful, maybe not even. And so at OpenAI, we're leveraging Harness, and we have essentially one, I'll call it, master pipeline, main pipeline, that does essentially what we want for all applications, and it's your, move fast and not break things, do a canary, and we'll keep innovating on that. But the idea being is that people use that one pipeline, so to speak, that template, rather than teams going off and reinventing the wheel, in any which way they choose to. I think this kind of brings us to one of those things is, we talk about the journey and the destination. People want to get to continuous delivery. They want to get to deploying every day, maybe not 4,000 times a day, but they want to get to that. And I think there's an interesting thing because it seems like a lot of people are always in that journey, right? And they might not even actually reach the destination. I don't know what your kind of thoughts are on that. Yeah, well,
It's funny, the whole journey versus destination is a great kind of analogy because, again, OpenAI is actually OpenAI has been around for like 10 years, but for all intents and purposes, it's essentially a year old, as we all know it is. And the mindset of the engineering team on the product side is deployments. Like we need deployments. And deployments is the destination. The journey is delivery, right? And what you, like when the business says we need deployments is, we need more deployments, faster deployments. What they're really saying is, again, we want to move fast. And it's just understood that they want nothing to break. And that's that journey, right? So the whole value of a continuous delivery pipeline is everything before the deployment. That is, because the deployment is kind of like everything worked, we're good to go. Obviously, deployment itself is somewhat complicated. You can canary that, whatever, roll it back. And we should come back to roll back and roll forward. But nevertheless, so the analogy that I've been using, again, both at OpenAI and at Netflix, is think of it as a journey. And it really matters is all the checks and things and balances, whatever it is, verifications that you want to do before something gets to that final destination. And that's how you know you have the confidence that you haven't ruined, let's say, the customer experience.
No, it's interesting. Even in like the GitOps world, GitOps is designed around the what. What is deployed? But for a lot of people, it's actually more relevant about how it got deployed. And to your point, it's that journey of how it went along that space, how it was secured, how it went through that process. And I think it's something that if we don't look at now, if we don't look at early in your architecture and design, it can become actually a burden because we're only focused on the what was deployed, not how it got there. So really that journey.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to business value, right? Like, again, every business wants to move fast. It's the only differentiator left, right? Because everyone can move, or everyone can build what, Walmart can build Amazon, and anyone can build an OpenAI type system, maybe. But nevertheless, how you differentiate yourself is to move faster than the next company, right? In fact, two analogies. So early days Netflix, it was famously said, we have to become HBO before HBO can become Netflix. So early days OpenAI, we have to become Google before Google can become OpenAI, right? The idea being is like, we can move fast, Google cannot, but Google, when they do move, they do it very well, and they can scale to like 100 million instantly, right? And so this, again, speaking to business value, deployment is just like, whatever, a step. No executive talks about deployment. Well, they don't talk about delivery either, hopefully. But they do. But delivery speaks again to what the business wants. Is again, we want to please, our members or our customers or whoever it is that you serve. And I think that's very important. Back to, again, all the conversations about platform engineering and the value of, let's say, continuous delivery is mapping those concepts ultimately to what the business wants. And I think it's very tempting for those of us in the trenches to talk very much tech and all the jargon, but at the end of the day, like, we're funded by like people that, there's a bunch of them here because they're all wearing like suits, and being able to translate like, this is what we're doing, and this is the value you're getting out of this investment, because again, platform and all these things are investments.
I think you actually brought up one, and it was fun. We, roll back and roll forward. And I've heard people talk about roll forward, and that scares the living tar out of me. But yeah. What's your view?
Well, and that's why. That's why I don't like the Dora metrics, because so one of the value, or one of the, and forgive me, I probably should have figured out or remembered the Dora one. But one of the things with Dora is like change failure rate. I think is and obviously you want that to go down, and if you build great delivery systems, and we should talk about what's needed for a great delivery system, but if you can build a great delivery system that obviously is built on a foundation of like amazing telemetry and observability, and you get those signals, you can roll back or roll forward very, very quickly. And so the idea of measuring bad deployments, I think, is a perverse incentive, because then people are gonna be like, I don't want to deploy. But if you can build a system that's like, no big deal, like we spotted it before our members did or before our customers did, and we'll roll it back, or more importantly, roll it forward with a fix, then like it's a meaningless metric, and really it goes back to is like, how fast can you move without breaking things? Back to the business wants to move fast and nothing break.
I think it's that. It's giving people the freedom to actually make those small mistakes, but then be able to execute from them quickly. So it's okay if you have a small mistake as long as you can get back, right? When it impacts customers for long periods of time, when it gets to the point where I'm looking elsewhere, that does become a problem. But if we can incentivize small changes as well, I mean, that's the other part, is doing releases in a way that's meaningful to a small subset. Again, whether it be feature flagging it out to a subset or doing canary releases, to even remove that blast radius. This is what's actually, so to your point, I actually agree with the change failure rate. It's okay to fail as long as we do it in a small subset and not very often.
Anyone here from CrowdStrike? Great lesson, right? I'm sorry if you are from CrowdStrike, and probably everyone here was affected in some way. But that's a great lesson for all of us to kind of like remind ourselves is like back to your point about blast radius. You can move fast and not break things if you just have the machinery in place to do small changes. When I said Netflix, stop measuring after 4,000 changes, that was not to one app. That was to the infrastructure. But nevertheless, right, is being able to move fast, make small changes with a high degree of confidence that you can roll back or roll forward. One thing to think about with roll forward, and this is when it comes back to tiers, and this is the discussion we're having at OpenAI, is rolling forward. It means that we know there's a mistake and we have a fix, right? We're going to submit a PR. Rolling forward has a bunch of dependencies, obviously not only on, let's say, harness, but like your source control, whether it be GitHub, I think someone had Bitbucket, and in your CI system as well. And those quickly become tier 1, right? Because if you can't get to your source code, you cannot roll forward. You can only roll back. Another lesson learned is in big, let's say service-oriented architectures or microservices. Rolling back doesn't always work. There's all these complex interdependencies that you just kind of lose track of, and so really the only way to fix it is just keep going forward. And it just goes back to this idea of once you hit that stage, that machinery then becomes tier 1, and how you staff your teams and how you look at the world is much different.
I think rolling forward 5 years ago or 10 years ago was actually an extreme risk, because we would go and put caution to the wind and we'd, go cowboy it out right on the keyboard. Yeah, YOLO, you only live once. And what's changed is now we've actually made repeatable processes so that even if it is right now, I can push that code through, it can go through harness, it can go through your security scans, your checks and measures very quickly and make its way into production with a high level of confidence. So for the first time, really giving people the actual ability to roll forward with confidence. Before it was rolling forward with, I hope this works, because I'm keyboard cowboy right now. I'm hoping and praying. I think that's important too, and I think you brought it up in the last one, is this all is actually determined on what we measure, right? And what we measure actually matters. And if we put the wrong measurements, to your point, and we even talking about deployments, we actually get adverse reactions. But this isn't just for, as we're building code, but even what we measure in the actual code and what we're actually trying to maintain, whether it's business metrics or performance metrics. And I think that's an interesting thing, is that I think what we've measured has actually changed over time. I don't know if you've seen a difference between Netflix and OpenAI or just in the industry as a whole. Yeah,
well, so definitely saw it, as I was saying, at Netflix from the standpoint of the early measurement was deployments, per day. Eventually it became operations per second, that was trying to translate to business value. Here's this platform, it's doing a whole lot. And also, I think another aspect of to your point about what you measure matters is our KPIs, right? And I think there was a session that was kind of touching on that. Something that Netflix got really, it was the FinOps one. Here we go. Netflix got something really well, or defined it really well, is this, the business value was streaming starts per second, or I should say it probably still is. Anyone from Netflix here? Okay, cool. And that was a very engineering metric, right? It was streaming starts per second meant people, and we knew at any point how many people were watching Netflix, and we could tell you that in the next hour, a lot more will watch because it's 5 o'clock on the East Coast or something like that. And that was back to also this idea of observability. If that number dipped, then you knew something was wrong, and we could do something with production. And from a FinOps standpoint, we just basically divided that number by the cost, right? So when you looked at the infrastructure, it was what did it cost per stream? And that also then incentivized teams to be well, let's think, obviously we want people streaming, but we also don't want it to we don't want that other number to go up and to the right. And so you can imagine that OpenAI has very similar, metrics and KPIs that are evolving, because that's the other thing with, I think, metrics is they evolve and people will game them. That's right. There was the talk about like lines of code and stuff like that. As soon as there's a metric, like then you can figure out what the game is that people will pay and or play. So I think to your question is I think it's very important to create business metrics that like can track back to like then development teams in the trenches understand like, why am I doing this thing? Oh, it's streaming starts per second or inferences per second or whatever it is that you're bookings per second or something like that. But then consistently looking at it to make sure, are we still getting value out of it? Are people gaming it? Like, is it giving us the signal we want? Because what you're trying to do is like drive behavior, right? Good behavior. That's another sign over guardrails over gates, right? If you have good behavior, you can put guardrails in place. If you have bad behavior, you have to put them in gates. And maybe if you're in a situation where you're looking at putting gates, maybe it's a time to look at metrics. Do you have the right metrics in place?
Yeah, I think are you incentivizing the right behavior? And it's one of the things that I've always said is incentivize the behavior you want. If it's tied to a technology metric, you're going to have a lot more of that metric. But if it's tied to a business metric that our CFO cares about, that our business cares about, that our customers care about, now we actually end up operating with a different value, right? We operating looking at the customer. We operate looking at it as the business as a whole, and I think it changes it. And it's actually hard. We don't see a ton of entities actually really diving in and making sure that they're even incentivizing our developers on some of those metrics that matter. And I think that's one of the interesting things that I'd love to see the industry change to, is focusing on actually incentivizing that based on what the business needs. And I know that's maybe it's a wild thing for some. It's much easier for if you're in retail or if you're in streaming, but I think it's something that we can actually do as a whole to try to make this better, just kind of globally, really.
Yeah, and actually thinking about metrics in some of the previous talks, there's this like path that companies go on, or maybe it's full of stages. I'm doing this on the fly, so work with me. But like OpenAI and other scale-ups are, they're in this phase where they're like, we've got lightning in a bottle, and we've got to like make it work for everybody on the planet, right? And the metrics and incentives in that stage are very simple. Like my metrics are like adoption. I'm just trying to get people to use the like tools we have. And then once you get everyone and once adoption is checked, then it's like, all right, let's start optimizing. Like now we can start talking about like, whatever X, Y, and Z. And it's interesting because you can kind of tell where a company is on that, like, that path, so like, or in the stages based on kind of what they're measuring. And so like some of the talks, I even think through my decade at Netflix, it's like that stuff was important during that period, and now it's probably not important because they're in the optimization phase of like, let's just, this thing's running really well, it prints money, let's just make sure it keeps doing that. And then like right now, FinOps, great example is like, early days of a scale up, there's not a lot of attention paid to like, how much is this costing us? There's other metrics that are important, right? Like, is everyone happy, right? Is it like working, Is it not breaking, And then eventually like you solve that and it's like, all right, checkbox, that metric's no longer important. We've got the 4 9s or whatever it is. Now let's start looking at like, well, what is it costing us, right? Back to the, cost per stream. And I gotta be honest with you, like, there are companies that aren't worried about cost right now, or they are. I mean, everyone's always worried about cost, but it's just not front and center for developers, right? It's like, let's not worry about that now. There was a question asked, like, who likes it when the FinOps people come and talk to you? Never, right? But actually, it's a good sign, right? Because it's like when they do come to you, it's like, that's because you're using a whole lot. You must be really successful or doing something right? So at OpenAI, we have a FinOps team, and it's a FinOps guy, and he's like, "Don't worry, I'll come to you when the time's right." I'm like, "That's all good, man." It's like we're good.
It's actually a funny story. So before we even had cloud cost management as part of Harness, our cloud cost management was John Bonney, our CRO, our CFO, actually going, "Hey Nick, why is this cluster $10,000 this month?" Right? And those types of things weren't quite efficient. And that was actually one of the things that led us into even wanting to solve this and bringing that information left. So bringing it to the engineers so they understood that change that you just made, the replica count that you just made, the size of the machine that you requested, like it might be okay for the business, but you should understand it at the onset, not a month later, not when it matters. And I think that actually follows through into almost that journey versus the destination. And I think if we take this as a journey throughout, you actually see this, again, those incentives change throughout because the business changes, but we have to constantly be reevaluating that. If we're not going back and looking at like what we did 6 months ago might not be what we need to incentivize, what we need to measure now, I think we're doing ourselves a huge disservice.
Yeah, and speaking of costs, and I'm sure things at Netflix are much different now from a standpoint of there's probably teams know the actual number of their costs on infrastructure, but in the early days, there was none. And then the next iteration was the Yelp style of like, hey, you want to do this thing? It's $1 sign. Oh, you're doing this thing? That's $4 signs. And it was just context for dev teams to be like, okay, because again, back to like guardrails over gates, give people agency, let them understand the context, and they'll, for the most part, make the right decision. And here's the best part, when they make the wrong decision, it's not because they did the wrong thing, it's most likely because you didn't give them the right context.
And I think that's it. You know, everyone who's picked that too large a system, it's probably because we didn't know the cost of it when we did it, right? And for the longest time, we weren't actually provided the information. And then I think that, to me, that's one of the things, and I leaned on it earlier, but it's about shifting, not the workload left, but it's about shifting the information left, meaning giving the information to the people that can actually affect change. The fact that this information hasn't been available for engineers for so long, it's maddening. Like, these are the people that actually you can look at, and the more engineers you have, the more developers you have, the higher your cloud cost will be. It's the one metric that you can guarantee, and yet we haven't been given visibility. And so that one is one of the key things we said is, let's get that information to the people when it matters. Because, by the way, our engineers are some of the smartest people we have at the company. They will do the right thing by default, but only if you give them the information. You can't make those right decisions if they don't have it in front of them.
Yeah, and in fact, the behavior that you usually see is people will over-provision, right? Back to the budgeting conversation. So I was at a startup before OpenAI, and we're learning on the fly, but we didn't have great transparency there, and obviously we were concerned about cash. It's a startup; you're always worried about cash. And sure enough, the behavior was as people would over-provision because they were like, well, I just take as big as I can get, even though I'm only using 10% of it. And then, once you point it out, then, oh, okay, it's a little better. But it's all about, I think, transparency, visibility, where it matters, in context, like why it matters. And then, I think 99 times out of 100, people will make the right decision. And the one time they don't, it's almost certainly because they just didn't have all the information you thought they had.
Agreed. Well, I'll tell you what, this has been a phenomenal conversation. Is there anything you'd like to impart upon the crowd here? One last kind of final statement before we leave.
Final statement. That's how
it's a bold one. I just want to put you on the spot for that.
Well, so I think we covered a lot of those, but I definitely see this pattern repeating in the sense of it's a journey, not the destination. So when you are looking at, let's say, continuous delivery, the key word is delivery, not continuous deployment, although that is a thing. And think about what the business is looking for, and you can speak to different business needs, whether it be like finance or sales. At the end of the day, people want to move. The business wants to move fast, but they want it with a high degree of like confidence. And the investment you put into a continuous delivery platform, at least I've seen it now a few times, pays handsome dividends, but it does require an investment, and then kind of looking over the horizon from the standpoint of it's a nice to have, and it will transition to it's a must have, and that's a great thing, but you have to kind of think differently in terms of staffing and whatnot.
Andy, cannot thank you enough. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.